Well, I think that providence is something that should be important to all of us, and I think it is, because it's one of the ways that we have to discern what the Lord's will for us is. And we often hear Isaiah 30:21 associated with God's providence for us. It says, "Thine ears shall hear a word behind thee, saying, This is the way, walk ye in it, when ye turn to the right hand and when ye turn to the left." And of course, we love that text. However, it's not always that easy, is it? There's no literal voice that comes behind us and tells us which way to go. And I think that's what makes God's providence difficult to grasp at many times. And another difficulty with providence is our own will. We often want something to go a certain way, or we want a certain thing, and we might tend to interpret providence to go along those lines, even if it may not really be the Lord's will for us. And so we often learn by making mistakes. And as we grow in Christ, I think we begin to learn to distinguish our voice from the Lord's voice. Well, just to get a little technical here, the word providence comes from the Greek word proneia. It's made up of the word pro, meaning before, and noia, meaning to think. So it literally means to think before, or to exercise forethought. The dictionary definition says that it is the foreseen care and guidance of God. On reprint 1560, Brother Russell makes some excellent observations about divine providence, and this is what he says. On the subject of divine providence, there are many widely diverging views. Even among Christians, some are quite skeptical with reference to it, while others view it in a light so extreme as to destroy in their minds the idea of human free agency and accountability. But to rightly understand the subject, we must carefully observe these scripturally marked metes and bounds within the limits of which divine providence can and is exercised. And then in that article, he goes on and he gives some limiting factors of divine providences. These are limits that God has chosen for himself. First, he says that since God is good, all his providences must be with a view to wise and benevolent ends, either near or remote. And second, since he made man in his own image, morally free, and with the alternatives of good and evil before him, it would be contrary to his purpose to hedge him about with his providences as to interfere with his free moral agency. And third, since God is working all things according to a plan of the ages, it is manifest that he cannot exercise his providence in any way which would be detrimental to the ultimate ends of his perfect plan. Well, brother, I think those are excellent guidelines in our endeavor to understand how divine providence works. And so to summarize it real quickly, God's providence will only be exercised for wise and benevolent purposes. God's providence will never overrule an individual's free moral agency. And God's providence will never contradict his purpose in the divine plan of the ages. You have to read that report article if you get a chance, number 1560. In that article, Brother Russell talks about God's providence and how it's used to supervise his dominion of the universe. And that's the article where that wonderful quote is taken from that we often hear, where it says that God is a great emperor of the whole universe, and his wisdom, power, goodness, and benevolence are abundantly equal to all the responsibilities of so exalted an office. The human mind staggers in its efforts to comprehend the mental resources of a being who is able to assume and to bear such responsibilities. And then he goes on to eloquently describe the memory that never fails, the judgment that never errs, and the wisdom that plans for eternity without the possibility of failure. And in my opinion, it's one of the most beautiful paragraphs that Brother Russell ever wrote. And it makes me realize that when I think of providence, I usually think of it on a much smaller scale. The Lord intervenes in my life. He overrules circumstances that I go through. And of course, that's true. But when we think of God as the creator of all things and the responsibility that he bears in maintaining his creation, we realize really on how many different levels that providence works. That article goes on to say this. He says that no one can fully comprehend the providence of God, But oh, what a thrilling sense of mingled reverence, love, and adoration fills the heart when thus we catch a glimpse of the intellectual and moral glory and majesty of our God. As we thus contemplate him, all nature becomes eloquent with his praise. The heavens truly declare his glory, and the firmament showeth his handiwork. If we could really see all the providences of God on its many different levels, how it works in our lives, how it works in the world and overruling the circumstances for the kingdom, I am sure we would be in total awe at his control and involvement with mankind. Remember that Jesus said the very hairs of our head are numbered. That's that small scale of providence. But of course, he's also working in the affairs of the world as he prepares it for his kingdom. That's the other end of the scale of providence. And so today we're going to try to just get a glimpse of God's providence on both of those scales. And I would like this to be an opportunity for each of us in this room to look back on our own lives, or the lives of our parents, or the lives of our grandparents, and try to get any glimpse that we can of how the Lord's providence interacted to bring each of us to where we are today. Because we all have a story. We all have a history. We all have something to remember that brought us here today and brought us into God's favor. Another aspect of providence that has often intrigued me is its relationship to the Lord's second presence. Now, we know that Jesus could institute the kingdom simply by saying the word. But we see that that's not how he's doing it. And the reason he's not doing it that way is because he wants mankind to get to the point of realizing that they simply cannot govern themselves without divine help. And so the time of trouble is preparing mankind to need the kingdom. And so you see, even in the psychology of how the Lord brings the kingdom about, he's doing it in the best interests of mankind, where mankind will be most prepared for it. He's overruling the affairs of man, in my opinion, by often working through human agencies in order to allow mankind's history to follow the course of the divine plan. And I think the Lord used these and many other people in special ways to accomplish what he deemed necessary. Now, of course, no human agency is perfect, or even necessarily Christian in the ones that he has used. But there was a specific work that had to be accomplished through them. And so he brought the right individuals at the right time to guide the course of human history. If we tried to get a comprehensive understanding of all the people that God has used so far since the Lord's return, it would certainly be an overwhelming task. And so I'm not going to do that. I'm not going to spend much time there. But I might come back to that in the future because it really intrigues me how specific individuals were used to accomplish specific works in preparation for the kingdom. Instead, I want to spend the majority of our time on a more personal level. And to get us started, I'm going to share with you an experience in my father's life that as I look back, it has opened up an avenue of thought and understanding that has simply amazed me. And I will freely admit to you, brother, that I am not sure that I am totally grasping how God's providence worked in his life. But if I am seeing what I think I am seeing, then the Lord's providence worked not only in his life, but also looked into the future, to the family that he would have. A family that would have some members consecrate to the Lord and run for the prize of the high calling. And I have thought about that long and hard, and I've wondered, does God do that? Does he look into the future to see coming generations and then possibly use his providence to also prepare the way for them? And I think the answer at least can be yes. We know that he can do that if he so chooses. And I'll give you a scriptural example. Persian King Cyrus is mentioned in Scripture by name some 150 years before he became king. So obviously even before he was born. Isaiah, in Isaiah 44, is quoting the words of God here. He says to Cyrus, "You are my shepherd. You will do what I want. You will say to Jerusalem, you will be rebuilt. You will tell the temple, your foundation will be put in place." And according to the Jewish historian Josephus, when Cyrus heard of Isaiah's prophecy, he was moved to allow Jews to return to Israel to rebuild the temple and the city, because he saw that there was a higher power at work if the scriptures could even predict his name ahead of time. The Lord was preparing the way for the work of Cyrus, that he was to sponsor rebuilding Israel after that captivity. And so God looked forward in time and prepared the way for Cyrus to be instrumental in advancing his plan. We also know that Napoleon, though not mentioned by name, is described in fair detail in the book of Daniel, far in advance of his actually being on the scene. And so we do have scriptural examples of how the Lord looks into the future and knows who will be there and what the circumstances will be in their lives. Well, brethren, I have to tell you, I think I've seen that in my life. This is not meant to brag or to say, look at me in any way. Please don't get that at all about anything I'm saying. This is simply what I believe is my family's providence and how the Lord has dealt with us over 3 generations. And like I said earlier, I would like you to take the opportunity to recall your history and to see how the Lord has done marvelous things in your lives and with your families. And so I'll begin. You know, when I was very young, I would hear stories of my father's experiences during World War II. And I would hear bits and pieces of some very interesting experiences. And when I became an adult, I finally understood that these were significant enough that I should try to preserve them. And so I did. I did an interview with my dad and I recorded it. And he went into great detail of his war experiences and how even then he saw the miraculous hand of the Lord in his life. And I started the recording by simply saying, well, tell us your story. And he, in a very casual way, he said, what's to tell? Well, I'll tell you, there was a lot to tell. And I'm not even going to tell you all of it today. A little later, I'm going to let you hear his own words about the Lord's care over this insignificant Italian soldier during World War II at the Russian front during the depths of winter. The experience began for him when he was drafted into the Italian army. This was, of course, before he was a Bible student. And in all of these experiences, it makes me think of the tabernacle picture and how the Lord begins the drawing process while people are still way out in the camp, people who are wandering and looking for something better. And so I think at this point in my dad's life, he was out in the camp. He was not in covenant relationship with the Lord. But these experiences would tend to draw him closer as he saw a need for the Lord. Now, his initial time of service in the Army was only 18 months when he was first inducted. He requested to be stationed in Africa. And I said, well, why did you want to go there? And he says, well, it paid a little more, and I had never been to Africa, so I thought it would be an interesting experience. And so he went. And so this was before Italy's involvement in the war. And so it wasn't a difficult 18 months for him, and he ended up being stationed in Libya for 13 or 14 months. And then after his service in Libya, he was discharged from the army. But after a short time later, he was drafted again because on June 10th, 1940, Italy had entered the war. And as you know, Italy was part of the Axis power, allied with Germany. And when I was a kid, I didn't like that because he wasn't on our side. But of course, it wasn't up to him. As an Italian citizen, he had to do what he was told. And after his initial training, he was sent to a post near Rome. And when he got there, he met a good friend of his who was from Corleone, where he happened to live. And this friend of his happened to be a colonel on that station. And under this friend's influence, he was allowed to stay in Rome for about 6 months, where he felt very safe, and he thought even that was providential. But unfortunately, in 1942, he was sent to the Russian front. It was a 2-week train ride to Russia. The Italian dictator, Benito Mussolini, believed that the war would be short because Germany was so powerful and that victory was assured. So he wanted to make his claim on some of the conquered territories. In fact, he actually wanted to reestablish the glory of the old Roman Empire. Now, there have been a number of books written about the Italian army's experience at the Russian front. I'd like to quote a book titled Few Returned. In fact, the subtitle is 28 Days on the Russian Front, Winter 1942 and 1943. That's when my dad was there. It was written by a young Italian lieutenant who was in Russia at the same time and whose descriptions matched my dad's description almost perfectly. This is what he writes. The Italian fighting units sent to the Eastern Front in the summer of 1941 were held in utter contempt by their German ally. The Italian Eighth Army was deemed fit only for a minor defensive role, and they saw little significant action until late 1942, when the Russians assembled four armies consisting of 1 million troops, nearly 1,000 tanks, and an equal number of attack aircraft, launched a giant two-pronged winter counteroffensive across a wide front in southern Russia. The Eighth Army was simply no match against this massive Red Army juggernaut and was quickly overwhelmed. Not only were the Italians woefully clothed, but they also lacked tanks and anti-tank guns with which to defend themselves. Within hours, the Don River front disintegrated. To avoid death or capture, the Italian and German troops trapped in the Don pocket began retreating in a desperate attempt to break free of encirclement. The flight of the Italians became a horrific odyssey, carried out in extreme sub-zero temperatures, often as low as minus 30 degrees. Unlike the Germans, who were occasionally resupplied by air, the Italians were left largely to fend for themselves with only whatever each individual soldier could carry on his own back or drag on makeshift sleds. The Italians were generally clad in warm weather shoes that many replaced with straw and blankets torn into strips and wrapped around their feet, bereft of ammunition resupply or transport. The Italians marched on foot across the bleak, frozen wilderness of Russia, virtually without sleep in the dead of winter, through some of the most desolate terrain on earth. They left in their wake a trail of corpses and abandoned equipment. Only the fittest and the luckiest survived the 28-day ordeal. Finally, in mid-January 1943, the survivors at last managed to break free of the Russian trap. The Italian Eighth Army had ceased to exist. In addition to those who died in the fighting during the retreat from the Don River, the official Italian historians later determined that some 50,000 to 60,000 Italian soldiers were captured by the Russians and sent to POW camps. Only 10,300 were later repatriated. The rest are thought to have died from abuse, starvation, and disease in the unspeakable conditions of captivity. We know that World War II has many horror stories of suffering and tragedy. My dad and his fellow soldiers could not have known what they were getting into. And I thought, the greed and pride of a misguided leadership of Mussolini brought terrible consequences to his people. And so my dad was part of a history that will not soon be forgotten, part of the necessary consequences of the permission of evil when fallen men are allowed to foster their ambitious schemes. What he told in my interview parallels exactly what is recorded in this book. He even used similar terminology. He had said that the Russians had them surrounded like they were in a sack, and that it was no longer a fight. For those Italian soldiers, it was purely survival. And I wasn't aware of this book before my dad died. My brother Joe had come across it, and he shared it with us. And if I had known about the book, I would have asked him if he knew this Eugenio Corti, the author of the book, because his descriptions are so close to what my dad described. They were experiencing the same things. In fact, there's one interesting overlap in their stories that I'll mention in just a little bit. Well, he says that on his way to Russia, he describes seeing men jackhammering on a river to get through the ice to get water. He had never seen anything like that in his life. He said it looked like the ice was about 3 feet thick, and he saw trucks driving on the river as if they were on a road. And I read that in that part of Russia and eastern Ukraine, the rivers are frozen from early November to early May. Now, living in Sicily all his life, he had never seen anything like it. He was only 26 years old at the time. And I asked him how he stayed warm. And he said, the Germans had excellent boots, insulated boots. And because he was a sergeant, he was given a pair of those boots. And he said that his feet were like they were in an oven. And I doubt that they were really that warm, but he said that they saved his feet. And then he also told me that he took a wool cap off a dead soldier, and that helped keep his head warm. And one story that he tells was when the Russians were closing in because the Italian tanks had run out of gas. His army was all spread out, and he was walking by himself, and he found 2 horses and a wagon, just all by themselves, probably looking similar to this picture. And so he took the wagon And he started riding on it, and he picked up 4 other Italian soldiers who were having trouble walking. But as the Russians closed in, they took 1,000 Italian prisoners, including my dad and the horses and the wagon, and the 4 Italians who were in the back. And as he marched, they were coming out of a valley, and the Germans who were at the top of the valley, who were supposedly on the Italian side, they started shooting at the Italians, thinking that they had simply given up or surrendered to the Russians. And the Russian commander who was in charge of the prisoners, he spoke some Italian, and he wanted my dad to leave the horse and wagon and march with the rest of the prisoners. And my dad said, I have these 4 men in the back, and I picked them up because they couldn't walk. And so I can't leave the wagon. And my dad kind of chuckled. He says, it really wasn't true. They could have walked, but it probably saved their lives. And the Russian commander then ordered 1 Russian soldier to go with these Italian prisoners and take them back to the Russian lines. And as they went forward, they saw both the Germans and the Russians shooting at the top of the valley. And my dad suggested, that's not really a good way for us to go. Why don't we go a different way? And the Russians saw the logic of that, and so they went down into the valley. And sometime later, as they were driving along, the wagon hit a tree stump and the harness broke. And as they tried to fix the harness, the Russian soldier asked if he had anything to eat. And my dad rummaged around the back of the wagon, and he actually found some food on the wagon. And with the food, he also found 2 or 3 barrels of honey. Now, he called them barrels, but they're probably smaller than the big barrels we normally think of. And so they sat for an hour eating, and they fixed the wagon, and they kept going. And as they were going east, they came across some small huts similar to this one. And as they went into the hut, they found that they were full of wounded Italian soldiers. And at that point, my dad took the barrels of honey into the house, and he shared it with the wounded soldiers. And this is where the story overlaps with the book, because the book also mentions that someone had found some honey and had shared it with the others. And when I read that, I go, there's my dad. And I thought, what are the odds of finding 2 horses in a wagon that had food on it in the middle of the Russian winter during a brutal war? And I thought the hand of Providence seemed to be moving for him. And after a while, the Russian soldier wanted to leave because there was a counteroffensive coming. And my dad says, well, none of us can walk. We're all frostbitten, so we really can't go with you. And so rather than shoot the wounded soldiers, as was commonly done, the Russian soldier just left. And so they were no longer prisoners. And when he told that part of the story, I hadn't paid much attention to it until I read what I read to you earlier about what happened to most of the prisoners who were taken back to Russia. The men in that hut were spared that experience because of a white lie. And I think in certain situations, a white lie can save someone's life, and I've seen it twice now. And I think the Lord may have touched the Russian soldier's heart to just leave him alone and go. Now, although it's tarnished now, my dad was actually awarded the silver medal for his help with the wounded. He kind of laughed when we talked about this, and he said, I might have gotten the gold medal, which is the highest medal that could be awarded. But gold medals are reserved for soldiers who were wounded. And since the Lord took such good care of me, I only got a silver. I thought that was cute. Well, brethren, of the 30,000 Italian soldiers who were surrounded by the Russians, only 4,000 survived. That's only 13%. And my dad was one of them. And he was part of that long march west out of Russia. He also told of one incident as he was walking. He happened to see a helmet on the ground, and he thought, it'd probably be a good idea to put it on. And as soon as he put it on, a random bullet zinged him in the head. And he said that his ears were ringing for half an hour. But man, was he glad he put that helmet on. And in his broken English, he said, the Lord provides in everything, and I don't know what the Lord can do. And I think what he meant by that was that he didn't realize what the Lord would do for him. As he walked further, he said that a bomb exploded very nearby him, and it shred his clothes from the shrapnel. But none of it touched him. And so there was another deliverance for him, because under those brutal conditions, almost any type of wound would have been fatal. In one place, they came across the finally named Death Valley, because there were so many dead men that they were literally walking on top of them. And as they kept walking west, they came to a large city and found deep trenches that the Russians had dug for protection But he said the trenches were full of dead Russian soldiers. That's where he had taken the cap off a dead Russian. And he kind of laughed and he said, well, he wasn't going to need it anymore, but I certainly did. And so now he was wearing German boots, a Russian hat, and of course his Italian coat. And he said again, when I put on the Russian cap, my head was like it was in an oven. And again, it was an exaggeration, but I knew right what he meant. I asked him how he kept his hands warm, and he said, well, he was very careful never to touch anything metal that would suck the heat out of his hands. He tried never to take his gloves off, and he kept his hands in his pockets as much as possible. But as I look back on my youth, I remember that his hands were always rough and hard, and I didn't understand why. But to tell you the truth, I'm not sure that he didn't have some lingering effects from the cold, but at least he had his hands. You know, this was such a chaotic and confusing retreat that as he walked at one point, he found himself all alone. They were all straggled out. And again, he came across a single horse that was tied up. And he was having trouble walking at this point. He said he was so weak that he couldn't even get up on the horse. He hadn't eaten anything for a long time, and he had been walking for days and days in bitter cold. So he said he found a little hill where he can kind of walk up, and then he was able to get onto the horse. And as he rode a little way, he came across 2 German soldiers who said that the horse was theirs. And he said, well, I didn't know it was yours. I saw it there, and since I couldn't walk, I thought I would just take it. So he got down off the horse, and he gave it to them. And I'm going to play for you part of an audio in my dad's own words so you can see what happened next. Now, the words are very difficult to understand, so I'm going to put the words on the screen so you can follow along.
If you don't get the horse, you get commissioner. No, because they take it. After they give me the horse, they walk about 5-6 feet away from me and started shooting my leg with the machine gun. And another guy said, stop it, what are you shooting for? One shoot, another guy stopped. And then decided maybe keep shooting more, you know. So when they finish shooting, I see my coat full of hole with the shooting. I look at my leg and my leg was broken. Nothing happened to my leg. But they wanted to put something on my leg. They put the hand anyway. But anyway, the Lord did never leave me for 1 minute. And a lot of people who had the fruits and everything, not even one hair fall on my head. Nothing. Thank the Lord until now.
I love what he said there. Maybe the Lord put something around my legs. He put his hand anyway. The Lord never leave me for 1 minute. Not even one hair fell off my head. Brethren, that's providence. And as I think about what the Lord did for my dad, I have to think that he did it for me too, and for my family. And I ask again, is it possible that the Lord looks ahead to see what a man will become and adjusts his providence? I wouldn't be surprised if he did. And if he did, it shows a being with more wisdom and power than we can possibly understand. And if I am grasping this correctly, it's given me a message that not only do I owe the Lord a great debt, but I owe it to my dad too. Because the Lord must have seen something in him to do what he did for him. And all that gives me a responsibility to live the most dedicated life that I can live, because that's really the best way to show that I appreciate all of this and realize that it's not just a story, but it's the hand of God doing great things for my family. And I hope that my kids or even future family members can see that lesson as well and be moved by the possibility that the Lord can look ahead multiple generations and see that those generations are worth this effort. Well, brethren, the story doesn't end here by any means, and I hope I'm not taking too much time. Let's just call this my personal testimony rather than a discourse, because I have to tell you the rest of this. Well, when my dad finally got back to Italy, he was given a month's leave to rest and recuperate. And at the end of his leave, he went back north to his regiment. And just about that same time, Italy signed an armistice agreement with the Allied powers. The war was over for Italy, or so they thought. Hitler was so enraged by what he called Italy's betrayal that he sent more German troops to occupy Italy. The Italian army was disbanded, and so there was no protection for any of its soldiers. My dad, along with other Italian soldiers, were actually arrested by the Germans. He was arrested, according to what he said here, somewhere between Naples and Rome. They were put on a cattle car, he said, packed like animals, and they were headed north, he believed, to Germany. And they asked him why he thought they were going to Germany, and he says, well, probably to work. So I assumed that they were being taken to a POW work camp. He says, I'm not sure where we're going, but I was sure of one thing, that I didn't want to go there. And so he tried to figure out a way to escape. He had noticed two small windows near the top of the boxcar, and he decided that he was going to try and get out of them somehow. Here's a picture of a Nazi boxcar that was actually brought to a museum in Florida. You can see their little window at the top. It's even got some barbed wire on it. Now, my dad didn't describe barbed wire, so maybe on his car it wasn't there. But brethren, this was not typical. I looked for a long time for German boxcars, and this was the only picture I could find of one that had a window in the top. Most German boxcars had no windows, so even this little detail may have been overruled. He was able to climb out and escape through that window somewhere north of Bologna after traveling some 350 miles on the train. And the night he escaped, he said, was pitch black. There was no moon. And as the train approached the station, it slowed down enough that he could jump out of that small window. He says when he landed, he kneeled motionless next to the train so the German guards sitting on each of the boxcars wouldn't see him. And then after the train passed, he walked for a while until he came across a small farmhouse. And when he knocked on the door, the people inside were afraid to open because it was nighttime, but they yelled to him that he could at least stay in the barn overnight. And the next morning, he told them his story. He said he had to get out of this uniform, and so they gave him clothes, and he left. And he actually walked back to the train station where he had jumped off the train and bought a ticket back south to Rome. Well, actually Rome was now a very dangerous place for a 27-year-old Italian man. Here's a picture of Italian civilians being arrested in Rome by German troops following a partisan attack a day earlier. And so, though they had been allies with Germany because of the Italian armistice, they now became enemies and had to endure German occupation. And it's not clear when or how, but at some point my dad's brother had given him a name of a family in Rome that he could contact if he needed help. He didn't know who they were. Somehow he found them, he asked for their help, but they were afraid. And they said they wouldn't help him, but they knew of somebody who might. So they gave him another name and address, and when he found them, they were willing to help. And he ended up hiding in their house for some 9 months. And during those 9 months, he said that at one stretch he had not gone outside or seen the sun for 3 consecutive months. It happened that the family ran a small business out of their house where they made socks and sweaters. They had this special little sewing machine for socks. And my dad wanted to contribute, and so he said, can I help you? And they said, well, we need our machine for ourselves. He says, but there's a broken one in the basement. So they brought it up, and he was able to fix it. And that first day, he was so proud. He made 30 pairs of socks. And I'll tell you, I remember as a kid putting the story together. We were sitting in our kitchen, and he brings out this box with this unusual-looking machine. And I asked him what it was. He said, that's a sock-making machine. And I always wondered why my dad would have a sock-making machine. But apparently he brought it with him when he came from Italy. Well, on June 4th, 1944, the Allies took Rome, and the war was finally over for him, and he got to go home to Sicily. And so that's the story of my dad's war experience. There's actually another series of events that led him to meet the Bible students, but that'll have to wait for another time. But brethren, I'll let you judge for yourselves if these were divine providences. The German boots, the Russian hat, the horses and wagon, the food and the honey they found in the wagon, the helmet and the bullet that had stopped, the bomb exploding and shredding his clothes but not touching him, not being taken prisoner while resting in that Russian hut, the German fire machine gun at his legs without any bullet touching him, his escape from the Russian sack in the middle of the Russian winter, his escape from a Nazi prisoner camp, and of course the help of strangers that he had never met before. And I think, can these all be coincidences? And I think thinking that might take more imagination than believing that it was the hand of God that wrapped itself around him. And what's amazing about this story is that we get a glimpse of the extremes of divine providence. Germany was not going to win the war. The Lord was going to make sure of that. In fact, the German loss in Russia was a turning point of the war. It showed that Germany was not invincible. As the German invasion struggled through the terrible Russian winter, it had no more success in spring when the ground thawed and turned to impassable mud, trapping the German vehicles. And so on a large scale, Providence worked to defeat the Axis forces. But within that larger providence, the Lord saw this insignificant Italian soldier who was actually on the German side, but a man who had a good heart and was willing to help other people. Providence worked on a small scale with one individual, while at the same time working on a large scale to control the outcome of the war. It just illustrates how the Lord can deal with every detail, and he doesn't miss a thing. The Italians lost the war, but some Italians were saved and allowed to prosper. And I think, what discernment the Lord shows in all his dealings. And so again, brethren, I encourage you to look into your past. You may not have a Russian front experience, but we all have amazing stories to tell as we try to see the Lord's hand in our family's life. And then realize what a burden of responsibility that puts on each of us. We can only repay the blessings that past generations have given us by the way we live our lives today. It's an intriguing exercise to try and understand how the Lord has been intervening even in man's affairs. And of course, the outcome of World War II is a very clear providence. God's plan would not be advanced by a German victory. In fact, Providence even used the evil intent of the Nazis to prepare the way for the rebirth of Israel. As the psalmist said, "Surely the wrath of man shall praise thee, the remainder of wrath shalt thou restrain." Well, in the few minutes we have remaining, I'd like to examine an important time even before the Lord's return. And I want to show you a reading of Abraham Lincoln's Gettysburg Address. And then I would like to discuss some of the things that he says in his address.
Fourscore-and-7 years ago, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. Now we are engaged in a great civil war, testing whether that nation, or any nation so conceived and so dedicated, can long endure. We are met on a great battlefield of that war. We have come to dedicate a portion of that field as a final resting place for those who here gave their lives that that nation might live. It is altogether fitting and proper that we should do this. But in a larger sense, we cannot dedicate, we cannot consecrate, we cannot hallow this ground. The brave men, living and dead, who struggled here, have consecrated it far above our poor power to add or detract. The world will little note nor long remember what we say here, but it can never forget what they did here. It is for us, the living, rather, to be dedicated here to the unfinished work which they who fought here have thus far so nobly advanced. It is rather for us to be here, dedicated to the great task remaining before us, that from these honored dead we take increased devotion to that cause for which they gave the last full measure of devotion. That we here highly resolve that these dead shall not have died in vain. That this nation, under God, shall have a new birth of freedom. And that government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth.
Of course, that's considered one of the greatest American speeches ever given, short and to the point. And its principles are so ingrained that they're actually etched into the wall of the Lincoln Memorial. It's very inspiring. And that speech was given 11 years before the Lord's return. And you begin seeing that the Lord is laying the groundwork for kingdom principles. It was the Lord's providence that this nation started with noble leaders committed to the cause of freedom and equality of all people. The Civil War was a tremendous struggle to maintain the direction of this country and keep it working towards those lofty ideals. In Lincoln's speech, he said that the Civil War was testing whether this nation or any nation, based on the principles of freedom and equality, could long endure. And that's why he felt that the war had to be fought, because these principles must move forward. But brethren, I believe that had the Lord not continually intervened and continues to intervene in world events, no nation that promulgates those principles could endure. And the reason I say that is because Satan is the god of this world, and he would not allow them to endure. The introduction of these principles was not merely accomplished by our founding fathers. It was the Lord who opened the way for them. Satan would never have allowed these principles to be part of the fabric of our country and then spread to all parts of the world, because his kingdom is based on lies and control and oppression. And it creates a class system that finds prosperity for only an elite few. I think the Lord has worked through people like Lincoln to begin laying the foundation of true and right principles. But of course, that war has not been won yet. This country alone will not win it. This world alone will not win it. There is a battle going on among the spiritual forces of darkness and light. And it seems like every step forward, there's a step back of people trying to take away these principles from the world. But we know that the outcome is assured because the forces for good are simply more powerful. Now, during the great debate over slavery, some interesting things happened. Some Christian ministers tried to convince Lincoln that slavery was not wrong by using scripture quotations. And after talking to them, this is what he said. I know there is a God, and that he hates injustice and slavery. I see the storm coming, and I know his hand is in it. If he has a place and work for me, and I think he has, I believe I am ready. I am nothing, but truth is everything. Douglas don't care whether slavery is voted up or down, but God cares, and humanity cares, and I care, and with God's help I shall not fail. I may not see the end, but it will come, and I shall be vindicated, and these men will find that they have not read their Bibles aright. Isn't that awesome? Was he the right man at the right time in the right place? There's no doubt in my mind that the Lord put him there. How can anyone deny that he was the right man for the advancement of these noble principles? But the continued pursuit of creating a world of justice and equity has been opposed at every step of the way. Lincoln fought for the abolition of slavery and the preservation of the Union, but that was simply the beginning. Actually, it wasn't until 1965, more than 100 years after the Civil War, that the Voting Rights Act was signed by Lyndon Johnson. Now, the Voting Rights Act prohibited every state and local government from imposing laws that would result in discrimination. Kind of a general thing, but listen to the example. States were giving literacy laws, and if you couldn't write or read, you couldn't vote. This law abolished that. There was no way to discriminate against illiterate people. And so the Lord opened up the way for poor blacks of the South to begin voting. I believe the Lord used people like Susan B. Anthony, who fought for the rights of women to vote. Even Mohandas Gandhi, who taught nonviolent protest against the British occupation in India, who worked against poverty, fought for women's rights, and other noble causes. In fact, his example helped Martin Luther King understand the power of nonviolent protest as he worked for black civil rights in this country. Cesar Chavez fought for the rights of poor Latino farm workers. And of course, Nelson Mandela helped end apartheid in South Africa. And if you go on Wikipedia and you look up the phrase leaders of civil rights, you will see a list of more than 130 names. Leaders, not just the followers. Men and women that the Lord may have used to advance the principles that all people should be respected and treated fairly. Now, this is only a partial list. That's all I could get on one slide. None of these people could have prospered in their work had the Lord not been supporting them behind the scenes. They weren't perfect. They made mistakes. But he used them to bring kingdom principles to the world, to begin to bring them, so that when the kingdom government is fully established, the transition will be more natural for this world. And brethren, I love Brother Russell's comment that I read earlier. A glimpse of God's providence gives us a thrilling sense of mingled reverence, love, and adoration of the intellectual and moral glory of God. So, brethren, look for the Lord's providence in your lives. Be honest in your looking. Be open to the fact that his providence may be different than your desires. When we see clear indications of his hand, then we too can feel that sense of reverence, love, and adoration for a great being who is willing to help us. May the Lord add his blessings.